I am Captain Lillian Booth, 28 years old, and I am standing in my secure office at Fort Meade, Maryland. The grief is still raw from the funeral of my uncle, Theodore, the man who rescued me from hell 15 years ago. The door suddenly opens, and two ghosts from the past walk in. My parents, Jed and Serafina. 15 years of silence, and now they appear, draped in cheap, knockoff jewelry, exchanging smug smiles about the millions they expect to inherit. If you're listening to this story, tell me if you've ever had relatives who suddenly reappear when money is involved. Let me know where you're listening from. Please like and subscribe to hear how my uncle's brilliant plan exposed their true faces and left them utterly broken. The silence in my office was a construct, a fortress I had built brick by meticulous brick. Here, within the sensitive compartmented information facility, the SCIF, chaos couldn't touch me. The air itself, scrubbed and cooled by humming government servers, was sterile. My world was one of right angles and regulations. My desk was clear, save for a single classified briefing folder placed perfectly parallel to the edge. On the credenza behind me, the American flag was folded into a tight, perfect triangle, each of its 13 folds a testament to discipline. This sterile quiet, this absolute order, was my sanctuary. It was the antithesis of the life I had escaped. The buzz from my secure line was an unwelcome intrusion. I tapped the speaker. Captain Booth. Ma'am. The voice of the young airman at the security desk crackled through, hesitant. You have family visitors. The words hung in the air, foreign and wrong, like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. Family. I had just buried my only family last week. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, snaked its way up my spine. I had spent 15 years ensuring that the two people who shared my DNA could never find me within these walls. Send them up, I said, my voice betraying nothing. The command was automatic, the discipline of West Point kicking in, but my heart hammered against my ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage of military decorum. When they stepped through the door, the sterile air of my sanctuary was instantly corrupted. Jedediah and Serafina Booth. They looked utterly out of place, like two garish weeds sprouting through the pristine tile of a laboratory. He was wearing a polyester suit that was too tight in the shoulders, and she was stuffed into a leopard print dress that screamed desperation. They were adorned with cheap, gold-plated jewelry that caught the harsh fluorescent light, flashing their counterfeit status for all to see. But it was the smell that hit me first. Serafina's perfume. A cloying, cheap floral scent that immediately transported me back to a cramped, dirty apartment that always smelled of stale beer and failure. It was the scent of my childhood, and it was a violation. They didn't ask how I was doing. They didn't offer a single word of condolence for the man who had raised me, the man who was Jed's own brother. They stood there, taking in my office, their eyes scanning not for signs of my life, but for indicators of my, and by extension, Theodore's, wealth. Serafina broke the silence, her voice oozing a false, syrupy sympathy that turned my stomach. Lillian, honey, I know you're grieving, she began, taking a step forward as if to offer a comforting touch I would have recoiled from. But we need to be practical. Your uncle left behind a fortune. As your parents, we have rights. You wouldn't want to make things complicated, would you? Jedediah just nodded along, his shifty eyes darting around the room, lingering on the secure servers, the high-tech monitors, no doubt trying to calculate their value. He never once made eye contact with me. I wasn't his daughter, I was a line item on an asset sheet, and in that moment, something inside me shifted. The grief, the shock, the sudden raw pain of a 15-year-old wound being ripped open, it all receded. My training took over. I wasn't Lillian the abandoned child anymore. I was Captain Booth, U.S. Army Intelligence, and I was analyzing a threat. I cataloged their behavior like data points in a threat assessment matrix. Jed's nervous fidgeting, his inability to stand still. Serafina's hand constantly fluttering to her fake pearl necklace, a self-soothing gesture. Their smiles were too wide, their eyes too bright with greed. They weren't confident, they were performing. They hadn't come just for the money. They had come because they believed I was still that helpless 13-year-old girl they had left at a bus station with $20. They had fundamentally misjudged their target. In my world, that was a fatal tactical error. The old voices of self-doubt, the ones that whispered I wasn't good enough, began to stir. The ghost of a general's lecture at West Point echoed in my mind. The most dangerous enemy is not the one screaming at you from across the battlefield. It's the one who whispers in your ear that you are not worthy. My parents were that enemy. Serafina, emboldened by my silence, gestured dismissively at my meticulously ordered office. "Honestly," she said with a sneer, "Theodore really wasted his money on this place. A single corner of his mansion is worth more than this whole office. You should do the smart thing and just sign the papers, Lillian." That was it, the final piece of data I needed. I stood up, my movements precise and deliberate. My voice, when I spoke, was flat, devoid of emotion, the kind of voice I used when delivering a critical intelligence brief. "I have no authority over Uncle Theodore's will," I stated, looking past Serafina and locking my eyes directly onto Jed's. He flinched. "All matters regarding his estate will be handled by his attorney, Mr. Sterling Vance, on Friday." I let the silence hang for a beat before delivering the operational command. "This is a secure military installation. You have 10 minutes to vacate the premises before I am required to report an unauthorized intrusion." The change in them was immediate. The phony smiles vanished. The arrogance evaporated. For the first time, they saw the uniform, not the little girl. The cold, hard language of my world had finally penetrated the thick fog of their greed. They had marched onto my battlefield expecting an easy victory, only to find themselves standing in the kill zone. They had infiltrated my fortress, and now they would play by my rules. They scurried out without another word, leaving only the lingering foul scent of cheap perfume in their wake. I stood in the heavy silence, the hum of the servers the only sound. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a hollow ache in its place. I looked at the perfectly folded flag on my credenza, a symbol of everything Theodore had given me: honor, duty, a country to serve. And then I looked at the empty doorway where they had stood, a symbol of everything they had tried to take. Their smug smiles had awakened the monster of the past. To survive, I had to remember my first battlefield, that house in Cleveland. The cheap, cloying scent of Serafina's perfume had finally dissipated from my office, but the afterimage of her fake jewelry burned behind my eyes. That flashing, gold-plated bracelet. It wasn't the cheapness that bothered me. It was the memory it replaced. The memory of the one real piece of gold she ever owned. A simple, thin wedding band. I remember the day she slipped it off her finger, her face a mask of cold resignation. She sold it to pay off one of Jed's gambling debts from a backroom poker game. That glint of fake gold today didn't just represent their greed, it was the ghost of the moment they sold off the last symbol of a family that never really existed. And that ghost dragged me back through 15 years, back to a place I'd tried to wall off forever, back to Cleveland. Cleveland, in my memory, is not a city. It's a color. The permanent, weary gray of a sky stained by smokestacks. It's a sound, a symphony of decay. The high, mournful wail of an ambulance was the melody. The sharp crash of empty beer bottles being thrown in the alley was the percussion. And the quiet, stifled sobs of my little brother, Caleb, whimpering into his pillow at night, were the bass line that held it all together. Our apartment in the heart of the Rust Belt was the orchestra pit, a place that perpetually smelled of stale Budweiser and the metallic tang of failure. Survival, for a child in that world, meant becoming an analyst. I learned to read threats not in reports, but in the smallest of sounds. My primary intelligence source was the sound of my father's key in the lock. A soft, careful click meant he was sober, and the evening would likely be quiet. A harsh, metallic scrape, a fumbling jangle of metal on metal, meant he was drunk. That sound was a storm warning. It meant Caleb and I had to make ourselves small, invisible. It meant a long, dark night ahead. Then came 2008. The Great Recession hit our part of Ohio like a physical blow. The steel mill where Jed worked laid off half its workforce, and just like that, he was home. All day. The already thin buffer of his job was gone, and the storm warnings came more and more often. He'd sit in his worn-out lazy boy, watching Fox News, and rant. He blamed the government in Washington. He blamed the banks on Wall Street. He blamed everyone but the man staring back at him from the clouded mirror. And his rage, having nowhere else to go, would eventually find its target. His fists, meant for a world he couldn't touch, found us instead. Every night, I would lie in my bed, clutching a worn-out copy of a book about General Patton I'd found at a library sale. I'd repeat his words to myself like a prayer, a mantra against the shouting from the other room. Courage is fear holding on a minute longer. That minute often felt like an eternity. But the physical pain from Jed was a shallow wound compared to the soul-deep cut of Serafina's indifference. I remember one afternoon, I must have been 12, Jed was in a rage about a foreclosure sign down the street. I was just trying to get to the kitchen for a glass of water, and he shoved me, hard. I fell against the corner of the counter, and a deep, ugly bruise immediately began to blossom on my forearm, purple and black. Tears welled in my eyes from the shock and the throbbing pain. I ran to the living room, to her, to my mother. She was sitting on the sagging couch, captivated by some brain-dead reality TV show. Laughter from the television filled the room. "Mom," I whispered, holding out my arm. "Look." Serafina didn't even turn her head. Her eyes remained glued to the screen. She just waved a dismissive hand in my direction. "Don't bother me, Lillian. Go get some ice yourself." Then came the words that killed a part of me forever. "You're the one who provoked him anyway." That was it. In that moment, the last flicker of hope that I had a mother, a protector, was extinguished. The bruise on my arm would fade, but the wound her words left on my heart would never fully heal. I understood with the cold, hard clarity of a survivor. I was completely and utterly on my own. And then, into that gray, hopeless world, came a flash of color. My uncle, Theodore. He was a myth, a name whispered on the rare occasions my father was sober enough for regret. He lived in Washington, D.C., a world away. When he visited for the first time, it was like a foreign dignitary visiting a war zone. He didn't smell of beer. He smelled of clean laundry and old books. He brought with him an aura of order, of a world where things made sense. And he brought a gift, a beautiful, polished wooden chess set. He sat with me on the floor of our dingy apartment and taught me the game. He didn't just teach me the moves, he taught me the strategy. I'll never forget what he said as he held up the smallest piece on the board. "Every piece has value, Lillian," he told me, his voice calm and steady. "Even the little pawn. Never underestimate anyone, especially yourself." It was the first time anyone had ever told me I was worth anything at all. The end, when it came, wasn't a tragedy. It was a disguised liberation. They drove us to the Greyhound bus station in downtown Cleveland. They gave me a single, crumpled $20 bill. "Your uncle will sort you out," Jed mumbled, not looking at me. And then they were gone, standing there on the grimy curb, with the smell of exhaust fumes in the air and my 7-year-old brother's hand clutching mine. I didn't feel fear. A strange, cold calm settled over me. I was in command now. I took that $20, walked Caleb to the dingy diner across the street, and bought him a grilled cheese sandwich and a carton of milk. I bought myself a coffee. I was a 13-year-old commander, and my first duty was to protect my only soldier. We survived. Later, sitting in the sterile beige office of a social worker, I didn't cry. I just thought about that chessboard. In one move, I had lost my king and my queen, but I still had other pieces on the board, and the game was far from over. I sat on a cracked vinyl chair in the beige, soulless office of the Cuyahoga County social worker, the chessboard from my uncle, my only possession. The game wasn't over, but I had no idea what the next move was. Then the social worker hung up her phone and looked at me with the first flicker of genuine hope I'd seen in her eyes all day. "Lillian," she said, her voice soft, "your uncle is on his way." It wasn't a notification, it was a summons. It was an extraction order. Theodore Booth didn't just act, he deployed. What followed wasn't a family intervention. It was a meticulously planned military campaign. He didn't just call social services, he unleashed a team of top-tier DC lawyers who descended upon the Ohio legal system with the shock and awe of a carrier strike group. I was flown from Cleveland to Washington, D.C., and I remember sitting in their law office overlooking the Capitol building. The chairs were soft leather, the wood on the conference table was dark and polished, and men in expensive suits spoke to me not as a problem to be solved, but as a person to be protected. They called me Miss Booth. For the first time in my life, I felt important. When the judge's gavel finally fell, granting full legal guardianship to Theodore, the relief was so overwhelming it felt like a physical weight being lifted off my small shoulders. My uncle was waiting for me outside the courtroom. I expected a hug, some grand emotional moment. Instead, he looked me square in the eye, extended his hand, and gave me a firm, solid handshake. It was the handshake of an equal, of a comrade. "Welcome home, Soldat," he said, a small proud smile on his face. Soldat, the German word for soldier. He didn't see a victim, he saw a fighter. His house in McLean, Virginia, was a culture shock of the highest order. It wasn't a palace of gaudy luxury like I might have imagined. It was something far more profound. It was a sanctuary of order. There were no overflowing ashtrays or empty bottles. The air didn't smell of smoke and despair. It smelled of lemon polish and old paper from the thousands of books that lined the walls of his library. Dinner was served at 6:30 p.m. sharp every single night, and for the first time in my life, I had my own room. A room with a desk for homework, a shelf for books, and most importantly, a door. A door with a lock. The first night, I must have turned that little brass knob a dozen times, just to feel the solid, satisfying click of the bolt sliding into place. The silence and the safety were so absolute, they were almost painful. Each quiet evening, each clean plate, each locked door was a bittersweet reminder of the chaos Caleb was still enduring back in the foster care system. The peace was healing, but it was incomplete. He was still out there, a soldier left behind. Theodore saw the iron core that my past had forged inside me. He didn't try to make me forget, he taught me how to weaponize my resilience. He gave me books. One of them, a leather-bound copy of Meditations by the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, became my Bible. I devoured the Stoic philosophy, the idea of focusing only on what you can control, your actions, your integrity, your efforts, and letting go of what you cannot. It was a warrior's code, and it gave structure to the raw survival instinct I'd relied on for so long. One crisp autumn weekend, he drove me north, up the Hudson River, to the United States Military Academy at West Point. We stood on the edge of the plain, the vast parade ground, and watched the cadets in their crisp gray uniforms marching in perfect formation. I was mesmerized. The air crackled with purpose, with discipline. It was the physical embodiment of everything Jedediah was not: duty, honor, country. "They don't care where you come from here, Lillian," Theodore said quietly, standing beside me. "They only care who you can become." In that moment, a new mission objective clicked into place in my mind. This was it. This was the fortress I would build for myself. I would forge my pain into armor. I would become unbreakable. I threw myself into my studies with the focus of a sniper. My grades became my new battlefield. The day the acceptance letter from West Point arrived, thick and imposing in the mailbox, I didn't shout for joy. I went to my room, closed the door, and I cried. Not tears of happiness, but tears of profound, soul-shaking relief. I had finally found my ranks. It took 2 more years. 2 years of relentless legal battles, of fighting a bureaucratic system that was slow and indifferent. But Theodore was a general who never abandoned his troops. Finally, the day came. I stood in the living room as he walked through the front door with Caleb. My brother was 9 years old now, thin and pale, his eyes wide and haunted from being bounced between foster homes. But he was here, he was safe. Our reunion wasn't loud. There were no dramatic pronouncements. I just opened my arms, and he ran into them. We stood there in the quiet, orderly living room, holding on to each other for a long, long time. I could feel the tension draining out of his small body, the years of fear finally beginning to recede. Looking over his head at my uncle, who was watching us with a quiet, satisfied look, I felt a profound sense of peace. The first and most important battle of my life was finally over. The Booth name, once a synonym for rust and failure, had been scoured clean and forged anew. Now, I could finally begin preparing for my own wars. If you've ever had someone in your life who was your Theodore, someone who stepped in and became the safe harbor you desperately needed, please support this story with a like. And if you know that feeling of finally being safe, I want you to comment with a single word: safe. Let's fill the comments with that feeling of finding sanctuary. The years after Caleb's homecoming were a time of quiet, steady construction. I was no longer just surviving, I was building. At West Point and later in my career, I excelled. The hypervigilance that had been a survival mechanism in a chaotic home transformed into a formidable asset in the world of intelligence. The ability to read the subtle shifts in a person's mood, to know the difference between a drunken rage and a sober threat, made me exceptionally good at reading assets, informants, and enemies. Captain Booth's career was built on the ruins of Lillian Booth's childhood. My comrades respected my calm under pressure, and my superiors trusted my analysis. I had found my place. I had earned my shield. And Caleb? Caleb flourished. Freed from the constant state of fear, the silent, haunted boy blossomed into a brilliant artist. He was accepted into the prestigious Pratt Institute in New York. His early paintings, the ones he made in those first few years with Uncle Theodore, had been dark and chaotic, full of shadowed figures and fractured landscapes. But now, his canvases exploded with color and light. He painted the Virginia countryside, the stoic architecture of D.C., the quiet dignity in our uncle's face. He had found his voice, not in words, but in brushstrokes. We were the living proof of Theodore's investment. Two broken children who had been given the safety and support to become whole. Our life found a rhythm, a sense of normalcy that was more precious to me than any medal. The best moments were the simple ones. I remember the Sunday afternoons in the fall when I could get leave from Fort Meade. The three of us would gather in Theodore's study. The roar of the crowd from the television would be the soundtrack as we watched the Washington Commanders play. The rich, spicy aroma of Theodore's famous chili con carne, a recipe he'd perfected over decades, would fill the house. It was a dish that tasted like home, warm, comforting, and deeply American. We'd sit together, Caleb sketching in his notepad, me reading a book, and Theodore watching the game with quiet intensity. We didn't need to talk much. The shared silence was a testament to our comfort, our bond. Those ordinary, peaceful moments were my heaven. They were the moments that made me believe the war was truly over. I remember the last time I saw him before he got sick. I was heading back to base after a weekend visit. He walked me to my car, the crisp autumn air rustling the leaves around us. He put a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "Always be ready, Lillian," he said, his voice serious. "The biggest battles often come when we least expect them." At the time, I took it as the advice of a seasoned strategist to a junior officer. I didn't know it was a prophecy. 2 weeks later, the call came. I was in the middle of a briefing when my secure line buzzed with a call routed from outside the base. It was Caleb. His voice was thin, trembling. "Lillian, it's Uncle Theodore." The words that followed were clinical, brutal, and absolute. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. Inoperable. The man who had conquered boardrooms and navigated the treacherous halls of Washington, D.C., the man who was my rock and my fortress, had been ambushed by an enemy you couldn't negotiate with, an enemy you couldn't outmaneuver. The world tilted on its axis. I secured immediate compassionate leave. When I arrived at Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, I found my uncle facing death the same way he had faced life, with a plan. He wasn't wallowing in self-pity. He was organizing his affairs with the precision of a general planning a withdrawal under fire. He met with Sterling Vance, his lawyer. He finalized his will. He spent his remaining time not talking about his pain, but imparting final lessons. Those last weeks were my final course of instruction. We sat in the quiet, sterile hospital room, the rhythmic beep of monitors the only sound. He held my hand, his own feeling frail and thin. "Money is just a tool, Lillian," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, but his eyes were as sharp and clear as ever. "It's a means to an end. Real legacy. Real legacy is the values you live by and the people you protect. Never forget that." He told me then about the final plan he had set in motion, the trap he had laid for Jed and Serafina. He didn't speak of it with anger or a desire for revenge. He spoke of it as a strategist. "It's not vengeance, Lillian," he explained. "It is a restoration of order, a final balancing of the scales." In the long, quiet afternoons, I would read to him. His favorite was the poetry of Robert Frost. I remember reading the final stanza of "Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening," my voice thick with unshed tears. "The woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep." He squeezed my hand. He was telling me that my mission was not yet over. He passed away on a Tuesday morning in late October, just as the sun was casting long, golden rays through the hospital window. There was no great, dramatic final speech. He just looked at Caleb and me, who were sitting on either side of his bed. He squeezed our hands one last time, and then he smiled, a faint, peaceful smile, and he was gone. His absence was not a silence, it was a roar, a vast, hollow, echoing void in the center of my universe. But in that void, he had left a spark, a mission. I didn't just carry his last name anymore, I carried his last command. The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery. The ceremony was a portrait of honor. The crisp snap of the flag in the autumn wind, the sharp report of the 21-gun salute echoing over the rolling green hills, the heartbreakingly precise ritual of the honor guard folding the American flag into a tight triangle before a soldier presented it to me. I accepted it, a captain of the United States Army, bearing my commander, my mentor, my father. He was laid to rest among heroes, a man of substance and honor. The final, painful contrast to the life of his brother, Jedediah, a man who had lived for nothing and would be remembered for even less, could not have been more stark. The funeral of Theodore Booth was an event defined by solemn dignity. Arlington National Cemetery is sacred ground, a place where the air itself seems to hold its breath in respect. The green hills rolled under a gray November sky, each white headstone a silent testament to a life of service. It was a sea of dress uniforms, of dark, impeccably tailored suits worn by senators, generals, and titans of the defense industry, men and women who had respected Theodore not just for his wealth, but for his integrity. And into this portrait of honor, Jed and Serafina arrived like two blots of spilled ink. They were utterly, offensively out of place. They weren't dressed for a funeral, they were dressed for a windfall. Serafina wore a black dress that was a size too tight and a faux fur stole that looked cheap even from a distance. Jed's suit was shiny, and he fidgeted with his collar, his eyes darting around not with grief, but with the greedy curiosity of a scavenger. They didn't carry sorrow, they carried an air of triumphant expectation. I watched from a distance as Serafina, with a practiced, saccharine smile, tried to engage a 4-star general in conversation. I saw Jed looking out over the hallowed grounds as if he were assessing its real estate value. They were not mourners. They were vultures, circling what they believed was a carcass worth millions. The ceremony proceeded with the heartbreaking precision of military ritual. The sharp crack of the 21-gun salute echoed across the hills, each shot a punctuation mark in a life of consequence. The honor guard, their movements a symphony of controlled grace, lifted the American flag from the casket. They folded it with reverent, meticulous care. A crisp triangle of red, white, and blue that held the weight of a nation's gratitude. A young, stoic Marine sergeant approached me. I stood at attention, my own grief locked down tight behind the rigid discipline of my uniform. He knelt before me, presenting the folded flag. "On behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your uncle's honorable and faithful service." My hands trembled almost imperceptibly as I accepted it. The weight of the fabric, the symbolic weight of his entire life, felt immense. In that moment of profound, sacred silence, a voice hissed in my ear. It was Serafina. She had slithered up beside me, her breath smelling of coffee and mints. She didn't offer a word of comfort. She didn't touch my arm. She whispered, her voice a venomous thread of envy. All this, it's just a show, you know. Your father is the eldest. He's the one who deserved to be buried here. It was a psychological strike, timed for maximum impact, designed to shatter my composure at my most vulnerable moment. She wanted me to break, to cry, to make a scene. But years of training and a lifetime of surviving her took over. I remembered the rules of engagement. Do not react to enemy provocation. Maintain tactical discipline. I didn't flinch. I didn't turn. I simply looked straight ahead, my gaze fixed on the distant Washington Monument, my eyes as cold and hard as the granite it was made from. I gave her nothing. My silence was a shield she could not penetrate. After the service, as people offered their quiet condolences, I saw Jed heading toward the parking lot. He had a slight stumble in his step. He'd clearly helped himself to the flask he always kept in his jacket pocket. He blocked my path to the car, his face flushed with liquid courage and resentment. "Listen here, little girl," he slurred, his voice low and conspiratorial. "Your precious uncle owed us. For 15 years, if we didn't keep our mouths shut about some of his old business deals, he never would have had this fancy funeral. We're just here to collect what's ours. What we're owed." He thought he was threatening me. He thought he was asserting his power. He had no idea he was delivering a full, unsolicited confession. He was confirming every suspicion, every piece of the puzzle Theodore had laid out for me. He was admitting to 15 years of extortion. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. This was a crime scene. I cataloged his words, his demeanor, the smell of cheap whiskey on his breath. All of it was data. All of it was ammunition. That evening, the quiet of Theodore's house felt heavy. The air was thick with his absence. As Caleb and I sat in silence, my phone buzzed. It was Sterling Vance. His voice was calm, professional, but I could hear an undercurrent of steel. "Captain Booth," he said, "I'm calling to confirm that the bait has been taken. They have made contact multiple times, and their behavior at the ceremony was exactly as predicted. The trap is set. Everything is proceeding according to General Booth's plan." A profound, chilling calm washed over me. The raw, searing anger I'd felt at the gravesite cooled and hardened into something else: resolve. This was no longer a personal battle fueled by grief. It was a strategic operation. I was not a mourning niece. I was an officer about to execute a meticulously planned mission on behalf of my fallen commander. Later that night, Caleb came into the library where I was sitting in the dark. He looked small and lost. "They're never going to stop, are they, Lily?" he asked, his voice trembling. "They'll just keep coming back." I looked at my brother, at the lingering fear in his eyes that I had sworn to extinguish. I stood up and put my hands firmly on his shoulders, forcing him to meet my gaze. My voice was quiet, but it was a vow. "They're about to, Caleb," I said, "for good." The days leading up to the reading of the will were a strange limbo. A tense, heavy quiet had settled over Theodore's house, the kind of silence that comes after a battle but before the war is truly over. I spent the time organizing his personal effects, each object a testament to a life of order and purpose. Caleb had retreated into his art, covering vast canvases with strokes of charcoal and gray, his own way of processing the grief and the dread. We were functioning, but we were holding our breath. I was waiting for the enemy's next move. It came on a Wednesday afternoon, 2 days before the meeting at Sterling Vance's office. My phone rang, and Caleb's name flashed on the screen. I answered, expecting to discuss dinner plans. Instead, I was met with a voice I barely recognized. It was thin, frayed, and trembling with a hurt so profound it felt like a physical blow through the phone. "Lily?" he stammered. She just called me." I didn't need to ask who she was. "What did she say, Caleb?" My voice was low, steady, a calm I did not feel. "She was crying," he said, his own voice cracking. She said you were trying to cut us out, that you were planning to take everything because you think you're better than us. She said you looked down on me because I'm an artist and not a soldier. He took a shaky breath. And Lily. She said Uncle Theodore only ever really loved you because you were just like him. She said I was always a disappointment to him. The words struck me with the force of a physical impact. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Serafina, unable to breach my defenses, had bypassed me entirely and struck directly at the heart of our small family. She had targeted Caleb, my brave, sensitive brother, who was still reeling from the loss of the only father figure he'd ever known. She had taken his deepest insecurities, the fear of not being enough, of being second best, and twisted them into a poisoned dagger. She was trying to break the one bond she could never have, the unconditional love between us. Listening to the raw pain in my brother's voice, something inside me didn't just break. It vaporized. It wasn't the hot, explosive rage of my father, the kind that threw plates and shattered glass. No, this was something far colder, far more dangerous. It was a cold fury, a chilling, absolute clarity that settled over me like a sheet of ice. The years of forced patience, of biting my tongue, of absorbing their cruelty to shield Caleb. It all collapsed into a single, hard, diamond point of resolve. They had crossed a line that did not exist on any map. They had put their hands on Caleb. At West Point, every cadet memorizes the honor code. A cadet will not lie, cheat, steal, or tolerate those who do. For 15 years, I had tolerated them. I had endured their existence, kept my distance, and in doing so, I had allowed their poison to fester. By remaining silent, I had tolerated them. No more. The time for tolerance was over. My hands were perfectly steady as I ended the call with Caleb, promising him I would handle it. I immediately pulled up Serafina's number. She answered on the second ring, her voice a syrupy, fake innocent coo. "Oh, Lillian, honey, I was just thinking about you." I cut through the performance with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. "Listen to me very carefully," I said. My voice was unnaturally calm, level, and sharp enough to cut glass. "You will never call Caleb again. You will never speak to him again. Your games are over." I could hear her sharp intake of breath, the surprise, the sputtering attempt to regain control. "Now, Lillian, I don't know what you're talking about. I was just—" "Save it," I commanded. "Be at Mr. Vance's office on Friday. I suggest you enjoy it. Because it will be the last time the name Booth ever gives you a damn thing." I hung up before she could utter another word. And in the sudden silence of the room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: liberation. The immense weight of 15 years of silent endurance vanished. The burden was gone. I was no longer defending. I was attacking. I walked over to Theodore's mahogany desk, the one that had been his command center for decades. My movements were deliberate, measured. I opened the top right-hand drawer. Inside, nestled in velvet, was his favorite fountain pen, a heavy black Mont Blanc that felt cool and solid in my hand. It was the pen he had used to sign deals worth millions, to write letters to senators, to sketch out the strategies that had built an empire. It was an instrument of power. I picked it up. Its weight was a comfort, a transfer of authority. The decision was made, the die was cast. It was time to write their final chapter. Everyone has a line. A point of no return where the duty to protect someone you love overpowers every instinct you have to keep the peace. If you know that feeling, that moment where you decide enough is enough, please support this story with a like. And I want you to comment with a single word that captures that feeling for you. Protect. Let's show the world what it means to stand up for the ones we love. With the pen still in my hand, I picked up my phone and dialed Sterling Vance. He answered immediately. "Mr. Vance," I said, and the voice that came out was not that of a grieving niece. It was the voice of a commanding officer. "I need you to add a few things to the agenda for Friday's meeting. First, ensure you have private security on site. Second, I need you to file for a temporary restraining order against Jedediah and Serafina Booth on behalf of my brother, effective immediately. The operation begins now. The next morning, I met Sterling Vance at his law firm in downtown D.C. The atmosphere was not that of a typical lawyer-client meeting. There was no consoling tone, no gentle talk of probate. This was a mission briefing. Vance, a retired Marine colonel with a ramrod straight posture that defied his 60-odd years, was Theodore's oldest friend and confidant. He greeted me not with a handshake, but with a firm, respectful nod. "Captain Booth," he said, his voice a low gravel. He led me into a secure conference room, the walls soundproofed, a large digital display screen dark on the far wall. He laid out a series of thick, meticulously organized binders on the polished table between us. "This is our arsenal, Captain," he stated, his tone all business. General Booth was nothing if not thorough. He opened the first binder. It was filled with years of financial records, bank statements showing regular structured payments from one of Theodore's private accounts into an account held by Jedediah Booth. They were disguised as family support, but the pattern was undeniable, a steady bleed, always increasing after a phone call or an unannounced visit. The next binder contained audio files recorded on a military-grade encrypted system Theodore had installed in his home office years ago. These were the phone calls, the wheedling, the veiled threats, the pathetic justifications. And then there were sworn affidavits from former business associates of Theodore's, detailing Jed's attempts to use his brother's name in petty scams. In my mind, I started running the analysis, applying the Carver matrix we use for target assessment: criticality, accessibility, recuperability, vulnerability, effect, recognizability. Their primary vulnerability was their own greed and arrogance. Their center of gravity was their belief that they were untouchable, that family ties were a shield. A fatal miscalculation. "And then," Vance said, his expression grim, "there's this." This was the most difficult part for him. He picked up a remote, and the large screen flickered to life. The image was from a discreet security camera, positioned high in the corner of Theodore's study. The date stamp in the corner was from 3 years ago. I saw Jed and Serafina. They looked younger, but the same aura of cheap resentment clung to them. They were demanding money. Jed was pacing, his hands flailing. Serafina sat on the edge of a leather armchair, her face a mask of aggrieved entitlement. I watched as my uncle, looking tired but resolute, refused them. Then I saw my mother's face twist into a sneer. "You owe us, Theo," she said, her voice captured with perfect clarity by the recording system. "You got lucky. You got the brains. We got the bad breaks. You owe us for that." I had to watch my parents, not through the hazy, distorted lens of a child's memory, but through the cold, impartial eye of a camera. There was no room for interpretation, no possibility of misremembering. The tape laid bare their pathetic, parasitic nature. It was all there. The bottomless greed, the moral decay, the complete absence of love or decency. A sharp, familiar pain lanced through my chest. The ghost of a 13-year-old girl's heartbreak. But it was fleeting. It was immediately replaced by the cold, hard steel of a trained intelligence officer. The pain was real, but it was now just data. This video was confirmation. It was proof. They were no longer my parents. They were hostile targets. "He recorded everything," I said, my voice flat. "Everything," Vance confirmed. "He knew who they were. He just hoped he would never have to use this." He then explained the masterstroke of Theodore's plan, the part that elevated it from a family reckoning to a strategic checkmate. "This goes beyond the will, Captain." 6 months before he passed, Theodore contacted the FBI's white-collar crime division. He handed them this entire portfolio, the financials, the recordings, everything. They opened their own investigation into federal extortion and wire fraud. I stared at him, a new wave of awe for my uncle washing over me. "Their appearance at the funeral, their visit to your office, their call to your brother, it's all been monitored," Vance continued. "Tomorrow is not just about the reading of a will. It is the final piece of the FBI's case. Theodore didn't just want to disinherit them, he wanted to dismantle them. We aren't just winning a battle tomorrow, Captain. We are ending the war." I nodded slowly, the full, brilliant, and utterly ruthless scope of my uncle's final operation settling into place. He hadn't left me a fortune. He had left me a victory. That night, back in the quiet house in McLean, I did not sleep. But I wasn't restless. I wasn't anxious. I was preparing. I went to the cedar-lined closet where Theodore had insisted I keep my spare uniforms. I took out my Army service uniform, the formal, Class A dress uniform. The dark blue jacket, the lighter blue trousers. I laid them out on the bed. Methodically, I prepared my armor. I took out my iron and pressed the jacket and trousers until the creases were razor-sharp. I took a soft cloth and polished my low-quarter dress shoes until they shone like black mirrors. I arranged my decorations on the ribbon rack above the left pocket. My medals, my commendations, each one a symbol of a promise kept, a duty fulfilled. I polished the brass of my rank insignia, the 2 silver bars of a captain, until they gleamed. This wasn't about vanity. It was a ritual. I was not going to face them tomorrow as Lillian Booth, the abandoned daughter. I was going to face them as Captain Lillian Booth, United States Army. I was going to wear the uniform that represented everything they were not. Honor, discipline, integrity, and service to something larger than oneself. This uniform was the real inheritance Theodore had left me. It was my shield. It was my sword. The conference room at Sterling Vance's law firm was set up like a theater for an execution. The long, dark mahogany table reflected the cool morning light. At the head of the table, Vance sat with his files arranged before him with military precision. Caleb sat to his right, looking pale but resolute. And on the left, I sat, my back ramrod straight, the perfectly pressed wool of my Class A uniform a shield against the tension in the air. The door opened and they walked in. Jedediah and Seraphina entered not with the somber demeanor of grieving relatives, but with the triumphant swagger of lottery winners arriving to claim their prize. Seraphina was wearing a gaudy faux fur stole, and Jed had on a suit that was just a little too shiny. They surveyed the room, their eyes gliding past Caleb and me as if we were part of the furniture. Their focus was on Vance, the gatekeeper to their imagined fortune. They took their seats opposite us, a smug, shared smile passing between them. The show was about to begin. Vance began with a dry, formal tone, his voice a low monotone that filled the room. He started by reading the minor bequests from Theodore's last will and testament, a generous donation to the Wounded Warrior Project, a scholarship fund established at West Point, smaller, personal sums for his longtime housekeeper and his driver. With each bequest that was not their names, I watched the impatience grow on Jed's face. He began tapping his fingers on the table, a restless, greedy rhythm. Seraphina's smile tightened at the edges. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of carefully built tension, Vance paused. He put on his reading glasses and looked down at the final page. "And now," he said, the room so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, "we come to the matter of Theodore's next of kin." Jed leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. Seraphina sat up straighter, a predatory stillness about her. Vance cleared his throat. "To my brother, Jedediah Booth, and his wife, Seraphina Booth, for the 15 years of silence for which I was so grateful, I leave the sum of $1 United States dollar." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like poison. "It is my hope they might use it to purchase a mirror, so they may finally take a good, long look at themselves." For a single, beautiful second, there was absolute silence. Then, chaos erupted. Seraphina's face went from smug to slack-jawed disbelief to a ghastly mottled white. The color drained from her cheeks as if a plug had been pulled. Jed, however, turned a shade of deep, apoplectic red. He shot to his feet, slamming both hands on the table with a deafening crack. "That son of a bitch!" he roared, spittle flying from his lips. "That goddamn son of a bitch! I'll sue! I'll contest the will! You can't do this!" As he raged, my mind went quiet. I remembered a verse from Psalms that Theodore had underlined in his personal Bible, Psalm 37:9. "For those who are evil will be destroyed, but those who hope in the Lord will inherit the land. I don't think you will, Vance said, his voice cutting through Jed's tirade like a razor. He calmly picked up a small remote control. Because the will is the least of your concerns today. He pressed a button. The large screen behind him, which had been dark until now, flickered to life. The security footage from Theodore's study appeared, sharp and clear. We all watched the scene of them demanding money, their voices tinny and harsh through the high-fidelity speakers. Seraphina's recorded voice echoed in the silent room. You owe us, Theo. You owe us. Vance clicked the remote again. An audio file began to play. One of Jed's drunken, threatening phone calls. His slurred voice, full of self-pity and menace, filled the air. Seraphina sank back into her chair, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Jed stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief. Then Vance picked up a final document. It was a letter, written in Theodore's own hand. He began to read it aloud. It was a calm, devastating indictment of 15 years of abuse, neglect, and financial predation. He detailed the beatings in Cleveland, the abandonment at the bus station, and the long, draining years of systematic blackmail. Therefore, Vance read Theodore's final, damning words. Let it be known that my true legacy is not my fortune, but the 2 children I was proud to call my own, Lillian and Caleb. The rest is merely business. As Vance finished, Seraphina let out a choked sob and buried her face in her hands. Jed stared at the screen, then at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. But no sound came out. They were broken. The stage was set. It was time for the final act. Right on cue, the conference room door opened. 2 men and a woman in dark professional suits entered the room. They moved with a quiet, confident authority. The woman in the lead held up a badge. FBI, she said, her voice calm and official. Jedediah and Seraphina Booth. Jed and Seraphina stared, paralyzed with a fresh wave of terror. The woman nodded to one of her agents. You are under arrest for violations of the Hobbs Act, pertaining to federal extortion and multiple counts of wire fraud. As the agents moved forward and snapped handcuffs onto their wrists, the last vestiges of Jed's composure shattered. He twisted, his face contorted in a mask of pure, impotent hatred, and screamed at me. You did this, you bitch! You did this to us! I did not flinch. I did not speak. I simply met his gaze, my expression unreadable. I watched as they were read their Miranda rights, their heads bowed in shame. I watched as they were escorted out of the room, 2 pathetic, greedy people finally facing the consequences of a lifetime of bad choices. Justice doesn't need a closing argument, it needs action. And the action was complete. The heavy door clicked shut behind the FBI agents, leaving a sudden, profound silence in its wake. The storm had passed. I looked across the table and saw my own reflection in the dark, polished surface of the wood. A soldier, sitting alone in the quiet aftermath. The war was over. But what about the aftershocks? When the conference room door clicked shut, the silence it left behind was heavier than any sound. The sharp, violent energy of the confrontation evaporated, leaving a vacuum in its place. There was no surge of triumph, no feeling of victory. There was only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The war was over, but the adrenaline had vanished, and all that remained were the casualties. I looked at Caleb. He was staring at the empty chairs across the table, his face pale, his eyes wide and unfocused. For a moment, he was perfectly still. And then, his shoulders began to shake. A single choked sob escaped his lips, then another. He covered his face with his hands, and for the first time since he was a small boy, my brother wept. He cried without restraint, the deep, gut-wrenching sobs of a soul finally unburdening itself from a weight it had carried for a lifetime. He wasn't crying for them. He was crying because for the first time, the invisible cage that had surrounded us since childhood had finally, truly, been broken. I moved to his side, wrapping my arms around his shaking shoulders, holding him steady as the storm of pent-up grief and relief washed through him. I didn't say a word. There were no words. There was only the quiet act of bearing witness, of being the anchor he had always been for me. After Caleb's tears had subsided, Sterling Vance, who had stood silently in the corner, stepped forward. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "It's done, Captain." He then held out a single, cream-colored envelope sealed with Theodore's personal wax stamp. "Theodore left this for you. He asked that you read it alone." Later that night, I sat in the leather armchair in Theodore's study. The house was silent around me, a new kind of silence, one of peace rather than tension. I held the envelope in my hands. It felt heavy, not just with the weight of the paper inside, but with the weight of a final command. With steady fingers, I broke the seal. The letter wasn't about the estate, or the money, or the business. It was a message from the heart of the man who had been my true north. He wrote about his pride, not in my rank or my accomplishments, but in my resilience. "I saw the steel in you the first day I brought you that chess set, Lillian," he had written in his elegant script. "I didn't give it to you. I only helped you find it. You turned your scars into armor, your pain into purpose, and for that, I am endlessly proud." But it was the final paragraph that changed everything. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. "This fortune is a tool, nothing more. My true legacy is not what I built, but who I saved. My legacy is you, Lillian. And Caleb. Now it is your turn. I am giving you one final command. Take the resources I have left you and use your strength to build something new. Protect other children who are lost in the dark, just as you once were. Find them. Fortify them. Be their shield. This is my last will. This is my only testament." I folded the letter, my eyes blurred with tears. He had not left me with a burden. He had left me with a mission. This wasn't an ending. It was an order for a new beginning. A few weeks later, a letter arrived with a postmark from a federal correctional facility. It was from Serafina. I recognized her looping, overly ornate handwriting immediately. I opened it, and my eyes scanned the first few lines, a toxic stream of self-pity, blame, and manipulation. "If you had only been a better daughter, none of this would have happened. I did my best for you children, but you were always so difficult." I stopped reading. I folded the letter, put it back in its envelope, and the next day, I handed it to Sterling Vance. "Handle this through the proper channels," I said. My voice was calm. The poison no longer had any effect on me. The border was secure. In the old days, Theodore had a saying he'd repeat from one of his favorite books on military history. "A good soldier knows when to attack, but a great soldier knows when to fortify his position and hold the line." It was time to hold the line. At my lawyer's advice, I agreed to one final meeting, a formality required before all contact was legally severed. I met them in the visitors' room of the detention center. They sat on the other side of a thick pane of plexiglass, looking small and washed out in their bright orange jumpsuits. The swagger was gone. Serafina's face was puffy from crying. Jed just stared at me, his eyes two hollow points of dull, simmering hatred. Serafina started to speak, her voice trembling, another performance about to begin. I held up a hand and she fell silent. "I'm not here to talk about the past," I said, my voice even and clear through the speaker system. "I am here to inform you of the future. From this day forward, you do not exist in my life or in Caleb's. We will not be accepting calls. We will not be reading letters. Any attempt to contact us will be dealt with by our lawyers. The connection is severed. Goodbye. I wish you luck." I stood up and walked away. I did not look back. That weekend, I went into the attic and found it. A small wooden box where I'd kept the few remaining artifacts of my life before Theodore. There wasn't much. A single faded photograph of the four of us, taken when Caleb was a baby, a forced, miserable smile on my face. A small plastic horse I had won at a school fair. A few other meaningless trinkets. For a long time, I thought about burning it. But burning felt too angry, too passionate. That part of me was gone. So I drove out to the Key Bridge, the lights of Georgetown glittering on the water. I walked to the center of the bridge, the cool night air on my face. I held the box over the railing. This wasn't an act of hatred. It was an act of release. I let go. I watched the small box fall, hitting the dark surface of the Potomac River with a barely audible splash before it was swallowed by the current and carried away. I wasn't forgiving them. I was forgiving myself. Forgiving the little girl who had spent so many years hoping for love from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I was letting her go too. And as I turned and walked back to my car, for the first time in my life, I felt completely and utterly free. Freedom, I discovered, is not a destination. It is a starting point. In the weeks and months that followed, the quiet in Theodore's house was no longer the silence of grief, but the calm of possibility. The ghosts of the past had been exorcised, not by anger, but by acceptance. With the war over, it was time to build the peace. My first act was to call a meeting with Caleb and Sterling Vance. We gathered not in a sterile conference room, but in Theodore's study, surrounded by his books and his legacy. I laid out the letter he had left for me, his final command. I didn't have to convince them. They understood immediately. And so, the Theodore Booth Legacy of Service Foundation was born. We didn't use the bulk of the inheritance for ourselves. We used it to forge a weapon of a different kind, a weapon of opportunity. With Vance's legal guidance and Caleb's creative input, we drafted our mission statement. It was simple and direct. We would find them, the forgotten kids in the forgotten towns, the ones with fire in their eyes and steel in their spines, trapped in the circumstances beyond their control. We would give them what Theodore had given us, a path, a structure, an ideal. We established scholarships for military academies, for public service degrees, for trade schools that built the backbone of the country. Our first partnership was a deliberate one. We reached out to the Junior Reserve Officer Training Corps, the JROTC programs, in the struggling high schools throughout the Rust Belt. I wanted to go back to the source, to the broken-down heart of America that had forged me, and plant seeds of hope. We weren't just giving them a check, we were giving them a new set of orders. Caleb, in his own way, contributed just as powerfully. He was no longer just an artist, he had become a storyteller. His first solo gallery show in New York was a staggering success. He called it Shield and Voice. The collection was a journey. The early pieces were dark and visceral, capturing the claustrophobic fear of our childhood. But as you walked through the gallery, the canvases slowly transformed. The shadows gave way to light. The chaotic lines found harmony. The final piece was a stunning, life-size portrait of Theodore, not as a titan of industry, but as a man sitting at a chessboard, a gentle, knowing smile on his face. I stood beside Caleb at the opening, watching as people were visibly moved by his work. A reporter from an art journal asked him what the title meant. Caleb looked at me, a confident, grateful smile on his face. For most of our lives, he said, his voice clear and steady, my sister was my shield. She took the blows meant for me. Now, this art is our voice. It's our way of telling the world that you can survive the darkness and build your own light. We had taken the wreckage of our family and reforged it into a legacy of service and a testament of creative strength. My own life found a new equilibrium. I continued to serve as Captain Booth, but the weight on my shoulders was different. I was no longer fighting to prove my worth or to escape a past that haunted me. I was fighting to protect the future Theodore had envisioned. The work was still demanding, the stakes still high, but my heart was lighter. I even found a personal peace I never thought possible. His name was Major Daniel Travers, a fellow intelligence officer who understood the quiet language of duty and had seen enough of the world to not be intimidated by a woman's scars. He saw all of me, the soldier, the survivor, the builder, and was not afraid. For the first time, my life had balance. A balance between duty and love, between the past I had conquered and the future we were building. The story comes to a close 1 year after the day the war ended. I was back at West Point, not as a cadet, but as the founder of our foundation, standing on the stage of the Eisenhower Hall Theater for our first ever scholarship ceremony. Dressed in my uniform, I looked out at the assembled corps of cadets, their faces young, determined, and full of promise. Sterling Vance gave the opening remarks, and then it was my turn. I spoke about Theodore, about his belief in service, honor, and the untapped potential that lies in the most unlikely of places. And then, I called the name of our first recipient, a young cadet from a small struggling steel town just outside of Cleveland. A kid who, according to his JROTC commander, had more grit and integrity than any 10 of his peers. He walked onto the stage, his posture perfect, his eyes burning with a fierce, grateful fire that I recognized instantly. As I handed him the oversized scholarship check, I bypassed the formal handshake. I leaned in, just as my uncle had leaned in to teach me about the pawns on a chessboard all those years ago. "Welcome to the ranks, soldier," I said, my voice just for him. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw myself. The lost kid, the survivor, the fighter who just needed someone to believe in them. And in that moment, I finally understood the full truth of it all. Theodore hadn't just saved me, he had armed me. He had given me the mission, the resources, and the purpose to save others. His legacy wasn't in a vault or a stock portfolio. It was alive, right here, in the determined eyes of this young man. It was living in Caleb's art, in my service, in the future we were now building for countless others. His legacy was alive. And I, at long last, was at peace. Thank you for walking with me through this journey. My story proves that your true legacy is not determined by the family you were born into, but by the ranks you choose to stand with and the honor you build for yourself. If you are fighting your own battles, remember that you have the strength to draw your own borders and define your own peace. If stories like this give you strength, please support our mission by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Every new member strengthens our ranks. Thank you for listening.